Okay, good morning everybody. Welcome to the October webinar. PROergonomics does our monthly webinar, and this month we are going to be talking about frequently asked questions for office ergonomics. So this is kind of a different format than our typical webinars in the sense that the content of this webinar is completely driven by our attendees. So those of you who registered, those of you who have attended webinars in the past, you've sent in questions, and I have set up this webinar then to answer them. So that will be the format for today's webinar. If you have questions as the webinar goes on, you can use the chat bar on the side. I'll try to address them as we go through, and we'll see how many questions come in. I have several questions that we're going to answer throughout the webinar, so we'll see time permitting on how many we get through. So just to give you a little bit of background information, if you are new to our webinars, PROergonomics does these webinars every month. Myself, I'm Sarah Snable. I'm the presenter today, and I'm one of the co-owners of PROergonomics. I'm a registered kinesiologist in Ontario, as well as a certified professional ergonomist. So I do several office assessments. I do all types of ergonomic assessments, and at PROergonomics, we're in all different types of industries, but office ergonomics is definitely something that's pretty common or unique. Well, not really unique, but it's common to all different industries. And when we do office assessments, we are doing more of those unique cases. I know there's lots of you who are doing assessments in-house, and likely that's why you're attending today, is just to kind of get up to speed on some of what's going on in office ergonomics. I'm going to talk about several different products today in particular, and just so that you all know, I'm not necessarily vouching for any one product over another. When we do our assessments, we always try to use the vendors or suppliers of our client, and so for that reason, really, I try to become familiar with all different types of products. I definitely have some of my favorites, or some features that I am looking for. So I'll touch on those occasionally when it comes up, but definitely I'm not favoring one product over another. So again, let's get started. There we go. So today's agenda really is answering your questions. I've tried to kind of group the questions in categories, basically. So I'll start with questions that are kind of about chairs and about keyboards and mice, and we'll kind of go through in that sense. I'll try my best to answer your questions as we go through, but you might want to just stay tuned and then and see if your question gets answered as well. I am recording today's webinar, so that way then in case you missed something, or if you want to go back and review it, you'll have access to that online after the webinar. So question number one. You might recognize some of your questions popping up here. So hopefully I'm answering them in the way that you want. So that's another thing too, is that if you want some more clarification, you can always use that chat bar, and we can always follow up afterwards as well. You can always send me an email. So are the CS8 guidelines worth purchasing? So when we do office ergonomic assessments, in particular at PROergonomics, all of our assessments are based on the CS8 guidelines. So for me to say that you have to purchase them, I'm kind of on the fence. I don't think that you absolutely need to. However, it would depend on what you're using them for. So if you're going to want to include them as a reference, then it's probably a good idea that you have them or that you've read them. There are lots of guidelines available online that are free, and they often are based on the CSA guidelines. It's just the guidelines I find are, if you can afford them, if they're in your budget, I think they're in the $225 range. So it's definitely, they could be worth purchasing if you need them, but I don't think that it's absolutely necessary. They did do some revisions this year in 2016. They reviewed them all last year, and then they got sent out earlier this year in 2016. So they have done some updates to kind of address the updates in technology. So now they talk about laptops, they talk about larger monitors, home-based offices, those types of things. So they could be useful, but I don't think that you absolutely have to. Okay, another question. This is a great question. We get this question a lot, actually. So is a keyboard tray essential? And really the short answer is no. They can be helpful, but having a keyboard tray doesn't mean that you have an ergonomic workstation, and not having a keyboard tray doesn't mean that you don't have an ergonomic workstation, however you want to look at it. The ultimate goal here of trying to set your workstation up is that you are working with your keyboard and your mouse at your elbow height. So you should be able to work in neutral postures. So if you look at the picture on the left there, this person doesn't have a keyboard tray, but what they've done is they've raised their chair up because the the mouse and the keyboard on the desktop was a little too high, would have been too high with their feet flat on the floor. They wouldn't have been at elbow height, which really is that ideal working height that we're striving for. And so they've raised their chair up. We give them a footrest. They don't need a keyboard tray. They can work with neutral postures. Whereas the gentleman on the right, a keyboard tray is a good option in this case because it lowers the keyboard and mouse down to his elbow height. So again, it's going to depend on the workstation. Sometimes there's not always space for a keyboard tray, and it is also going to depend on the tasks that the person does. I find that if you're doing a lot of paperwork or other tasks on the desk, like maybe using a scanner, or if you are going back and forth between reading and reviewing documents, anything that's kind of pulling you towards the desk, then a keyboard tray, you know, it really does pull you a little bit further away, so you might end up doing more rolling in your chair. It may not be as practical for some workstation setups. So you want to see if your chair can go high enough and you can put in a footrest. That might be, it's a quick option, it's a cheap option, much cheaper than installing a keyboard tray. So you don't have to have a keyboard tray, but the ideal goal is that we're trying to get your keyboard and mouse at your elbow height so that you can work with the relaxed or the neutral shoulder, wrist, and elbow postures. So you might need it if you can't get there with just adjusting the chair. Sticking on this note here of whether the keyboard tray is essential, I just want to highlight that, you know, you want to pick the right keyboard tray. So for example, if you are working in a corner workstation, or if you're working on a straight edge, then picking a straight board or a standard one that you're going to see in most catalogs is going to be fine for you. If you work at a workstation, or the employee works at a workstation that is a rounded corner, so you work in a bit of a curve, then that keyboard tray that's pictured at the top right, that's probably a better fit because it's rounded. So it's going to fit with the shape of the keyboard. You're not going to lose any access or working space on your actual keyboard tray. So I'm trying to explain that to you. If you look at the picture on the left, they actually have a bit of a, I guess, a corner maker there. So it helps to give some space. And actually, I'm going to flip to the next slide here just to give you a visual. So here's an example. When you are working in a corner. So tips to set up a keyboard tray when you're working in the corner. So if you are working in the 90-degree corner and you install a keyboard tray, it may or may not work. So there's a couple things you're going to want to look for. You need to make sure that that arm can pull out far enough, because if you just get kind of a, out of the box arm, it might only pull out or slide out. I forget what the standard is, like 20 inches or something. It might not be far enough though to clear the corner. So your mouse might actually end up kind of underneath of the desk, if you can picture that. So you want to make sure, one, that the arm can pull out far enough, or the other option is adding one of these, I call them a corner maker piece. So it creates a flat surface between the 90-degree corner, and the keyboard tray underneath it can actually get mounted to that, so it kind of gives you an extra couple of inches so the keyboard can be pulled out to you. Just keep in mind that when you're working in the 90-degree corner there, usually those desks aren't really designed. The intent is not that they were going to install a keyboard tray or put the keyboard in the corner of the workstation. So my first goal in this is that before I put in a corner maker or install a keyboard tray in the corners, I always look to make sure, like, is that really the spot that we want to install it? Ideally we want to work on a straight edge. It just makes things a little simpler. And if we can't do that, then I am looking for which keyboard tray will be the right option and what, like, if we're going to need to add a corner maker. So those are things to keep in mind. If you are going to work in the corner. It's not to say that you can't. It will pull you a little bit further away from the desk as well, so you're going to want to make sure that you're factoring in the tasks that the employee does as well, to make sure that they're not so far away from their desk. You're going to bring your monitor closer, but you are going to be further away from your desk on the whole. Moving along, how do I properly set up dual screens? This is probably the most common question that we are seeing right now, that we're getting. It is so common to see people working off of 2 screens. Screens are getting bigger and bigger. People are wanting 2 screens. They think it's making them more productive. So how do we go about setting them up? What I tend to see is really a mixed bag when I go out there and do assessments. I think probably most common is that I see, it's a mixture. Sometimes people are set up okay, but it hasn't necessarily been intentional. And often what I find is that people are centered with their monitors. So they're working on two monitors and they have their keyboard directly in the middle. So really they are centered with the seam of the monitors, basically. What that's going to mean is that you are twisting no matter what. You've got to twist your neck to look at the right screen, you twist your neck to look at the left screen. So for no portion of the day is your neck really in a neutral posture. You're not really looking straight ahead because how much of your work is actually on the far right or the far left edges of the screen, right there in the middle. So when it comes to how to set up two screens, really you need to pick a primary monitor. You should pick a primary monitor, which means that is the monitor that you do most of your work off of. That one should be centered directly in front of your body. That way then for most of your tasks, even if it's only 60% of the day, you are going to be looking straight ahead, right? There won't be twisting. You're going to look straight ahead at the monitor. Your neck will be in neutral. And then that secondary monitor you're going to want to set up on either the right or the left side, and you can angle it a bit towards you, but that one is not going to be directly centered. So there will be some twisting to look at the secondary monitor, but it should be, because it's a secondary monitor, it really should be a lower percentage of your tasks. I know I get a lot of sort of arguments back here. Well, I use both monitors equally, and so I really challenge you to pick a primary monitor. So do you really use them fully equally, and can you do your tasks in a different way? Can maybe we screen share? So can you split your screens? Can you drag the windows? Can you drag the programs that you're using? If you're using your email right now, drag it to your primary screen, the one that's centered in front of you. If you are now going to be working on a spreadsheet or you're going to be writing up a report, drag that window over to your primary screen. It takes a little bit of teaching, but I do think that it is beneficial because then you're going to do a lot less twisting, right? I mean, personally, I'm not necessarily on board that I don't think everybody needs to have two screens. With the way that screens are getting wider and wider, I think that we can be pretty productive if we just have, one screen. Maybe we could split the screens. And if we're going to have dual screens, I really prefer to see the secondary screen as really that, a secondary or a reference screen. And if you're interested in some tips on how to, what side do you put the secondary monitor on? Maybe you just put it on the right side because that's where there's space, but there is actually a thing called eye dominance. So what I'm going to get you to do is, here's just a little tip that you can do. So you need to get a little further away from your screen. So I don't know how much space you all have at your workstation, but what you want to do is make a frame around this eye picture that I have on the screen. So like the hands are here, you want to be about 10 feet roughly from this image. And so if you can't get that far away from your monitor, maybe pick something else on the wall that you can make a frame around. And I want you to look at it with both eyes open. So you've got a frame around the picture. Your arms need to be straight out in front of you. You make a frame around that picture. Okay, now I want you to close your left eye. You're looking at the picture with your right eye. So your left eye is closed. Is that picture still centered? Okay, now open both eyes. And now you're going to close the other eye. So close your right eye. You're looking at the picture with your left eye. Your right eye is closed. Is that picture still centered? Okay, so whichever eye kept the picture the most centered. So for me in particular, when my right eye was open, that picture was centered. When my left eye was just opened, that picture skewed way out of my hand frame. So what that means is that I am right eye dominant, and I am probably better suited that if I were to have two screens, I'm probably better suited to put my secondary screen on the right side. It means that my right eye is probably a little bit stronger, and I might do a little bit less twisting because my eye will be able to do that work for me. It's not to say that you have to do it that way because, again, we're going to look at the space that's available, but just an interesting tip that I find can help with that second screen placement. So here's another question that we get quite often. Are chairs with mesh backs a good option? So when it comes to seating, really we're looking for adjustability. We need to make sure that it is supporting you in the right ways. So you should be comfortable when you're sitting. You should have support for your lumbar area, so for your lower back. And you should have it should fit multiple users. So just be careful with the mesh backs. There are definitely some good ones out there, and there are some not so good ones out there. Some people say the mesh backs are better for breathability. Maybe it's even an aesthetic thing that it looks more modern. Ultimately, I'm mostly concerned about adjustability. So this chair that's on the left here, the red chair, this chair is, it has like an open back, and this chair in particular can come with a mesh back, but it has all of the same adjustability features as a chair that would have a fabric back or a fully fabric chair. And so I do like that chair. In that case, that kind of a quote-unquote mesh back chair, I would think is just fine. The one on the right, I think it's also a decent chair. What you'll notice is that the whole chair is mesh. It looks a little different in terms of how it adjusts, but it does still have all of those adjustability features, and you can actually see that it has a little lumbar piece, I guess, in the low back there. And with these chairs in particular, with this brand, I know that you can get it so that the lumbar will adjust a little bit, but the lumbar adjustability is not, there's not as much lumbar adjustability in that fully mesh chair. So you just want to make sure that you're not forgetting about that lumbar support and the other adjustability features. The breathability or the aesthetics may not necessarily be your #1 feature. I think that as long as we have good low back support, I'm of the tendency that it's rare that I recommend a mesh back chair. I will probably go to a fabric chair more often than not, unless my client has a mesh back chair as their standard, and in that case, I will choose from what they have standardized, making sure that it still meets the adjustability features. So I am just going to pop over to the questions here. So someone is asking if slides will be available after the webinar. Slides, not necessarily the PDF slides or the PowerPoint slides, but I am recording the webinar, so that recording will be available so you can review all of this. And another question coming is, do you have a favorite or a preferred brand of mesh back chairs, or ones that you really don't like or recommend? And in terms of brand wise, I can't necessarily speak to the brands. This one on the right here is a Herman Miller chair, and I think that it's pretty good if you have the budget to buy Herman Miller chairs. There are other mesh back chairs, and I don't know the brands off the top of my head, but again, really it's about adjustability for me. The red chair on the left here is an Ergocentric chair. I know they make a whole bunch of chairs, and I am a fan of Ergocentric because all of their chairs have adjustability, so I'm never really worried when I see an Ergocentric chair. I know that it's going to have the adjustability that I'm looking for. So moving along, how tall does a backrest need to be? So when we're looking at our chair, again, the key thing about a backrest is that it needs to give you lumbar support, so support for your lower back. When you're sitting, your spine does get compressed. We're not in a fully neutral posture, so having that support for the low back to kind of push the spine into a little bit closer to its neutral posture is really important. You want it to help kind of put that curve back in your spine, right? When we sit, it flattens everything, and it's not great for a long period of time, but if we can have some better back support, then it helps with sitting. So really the backrest, you want to, if it's adjustable, great, because then it's going to fit more people, right? You can slide it up and down, and then it's going to be able to fit, somebody who's 5'2" and somebody who's 6'2", ideally. So I've got another picture here just to go through, sir. So your backrest, it should come to at least your shoulder blades. If it's going, really only to the middle of your back, like a really small, I'm picturing those backrests that are almost like little circles, like a task chair, really. For some people, they might find that's comfortable, but for the majority of people who are doing, a lot of sitting at their computer or at their desk, they are probably going to want a little bit more back support. And so really the general guideline is that it should be at least to their shoulder blades. So you can see there are 4 different people in this picture. They are all different sizes, different heights, and the backrest is, in this case, the backrest of the chair is adjusted for all of them. And I think even possibly different sizes of chairs. So for example, the gentleman in the middle with the blue shirt, he's got a headrest option on his chair. So I'm not sure how tall this guy is. He is definitely over 6 feet tall, so he probably has a little bit of a taller backrest. The headrest option is interesting. I definitely don't recommend that on every single chair. It would definitely depend on the individual and if I thought that they needed. So people who have some upper back issues or neck issues, whether it's been an injury or that's where their main discomfort is, a headrest might be a good option for them, or having a little bit of a taller backrest that actually comes up to their head. Again, for some people, you know, if they don't really need that, they're probably not going to use it. And if anything, it's more going to get in the way. I often think about women who wear their hair in a ponytail or have a clip in the back, for example, and unless they're having neck pain, they're likely not going to use a really tall backrest or a headrest. They'll probably find that it gets in the way more than anything. So just some other little things to consider, but the general guideline is that it should come up to the shoulder blades to make sure that you're getting support for the whole back. And again, don't forget about that lumbar support. Really, that's the key. Are chair armrests necessary? I love this question because really the answer is no. But there are some pros and cons, because I would say no for some people and yes for other people. So a pro for armrests is that it can be a good break, or it can be a good way to take the load off of your shoulders and your neck. So when you're sitting there reading something on your screen, or you're in between thoughts, you're listening to a webinar, for example, maybe you're using the armrests. But when you go to type, one of the cons might be that it could interfere with your keyboard tray or your desk. So for some people, when they're adjusted to the right height, right? So you want to adjust those armrests so that they are just underneath of your elbow height, so they're taking that load off. You don't want them to be so high that you've got your shoulders raised or hunched. And if they're too low, then what can happen is sometimes people will lean to the side. They'll kind of lean to use them. And so again, that would be another con, right? Is that sometimes if they're not adjusted properly, they're actually leading to worse posture. But when people adjust them to the right height, in some cases it might actually affect how close they can pull into their keyboard or their desk. And in those cases, I have at times recommended to remove the armrests, because then it helps to get them in a bit closer. What I also find is that sometimes the armrests can be really wide, and so if you don't have, you know, really broad shoulders, then to use the armrest, you actually end up bringing your shoulders out away. Your elbows go out from your body, right? So then your shoulders end up compensating, and it can create some tight muscles up in your neck and your shoulder area. So you want to make sure that if you are going to have armrests, that they fit you, that they fit the user. So armrests nowadays, you can get them pivoting. You can get them where they slide in and out, so they can get wider and more narrow. And so those are other options to consider. So if you're going to pick one chair to standardize for your entire office, it might be a good idea to look for a chair that does have those armrest options for adjustability. And that way then you're kind of accommodating like a petite woman, for example, who doesn't have a very broad shoulder width, as well, like a larger male, for example, where their shoulder width is going to be bigger, and so, you know, armrests that don't, they might want their armrests to go out a little bit, or they may not need them to pivot inwards. So really you just want to be cautious about the armrests to make sure that they're not actually causing worse postures, or that they're not interfering. I know that there are some companies in particular who won't send you a chair without armrests, because they feel that it might be a safety concern, right? So you need the armrest to, if you're getting up and down from your desk, or from your chair, for example, the armrests are kind of like a handle. However, I mean, usually you can just use a screwdriver and you can take them off yourself. I don't know, I'm kind of on the fence. I don't necessarily see them as needed for safety. I think it would depend on how high you were sitting in your chair. I mean, the chairs wheel anyways, so I'm not sure if it's really meant to be a handle. The chances or the likelihood of somebody falling out of their chair because they don't have armrests, I think, would be pretty slim. So from a safety perspective, I can't really comment on that, but I definitely, for example, I don't have armrests on my chair. I find that they do cause me to work with worse posture. I tend to lean on them, and so what I ended up doing on the chair that I have is that I have armrests that actually swing away. Now that is a bit of an extra cost and a feature, right? But my armrests, I can raise them up and down, they pivot, but then I can also swing them away so they can hang underneath of my chair and I don't have to use them. But then I have the option of using them when I want. So there are other options that you can consider, but armrests, the short answer really is that they are not necessary. It's going to depend on the user. Here's an interesting question. Are armrest trays a good option, and when? So honestly, I have never, once I have recommended an armrest tray in my career as an ergonomist. I think what's important here is that we're looking at the overall desk setup and why somebody might be asking for one of these, or to really think about when we would recommend one of these, because it ultimately is going to limit shoulder movement. So my first thought really was like, okay, well, if you're having shoulder pain or a shoulder injury, this would be an interesting way of bringing the mouse close to you, right? So you can't get any more neutral shoulder posture than this. If the armrest is the right width and the right height for you, then your mouse is going to be right there. You're not going to have to really move your shoulder much at all. However, when we talk about good mousing technique, often the movement is supposed to start from the shoulder as opposed to you just anchoring your elbow and your wrist, because that can cause a lot of strain just on the small wrist muscles if you're just anchoring your wrist and using your mouse in that way. It takes a lot more on the wrist. So I mean, the quote-unquote best practice mousing technique is to have it start from your shoulder. So again, I would think this might be more for an accommodation case or a very special request. And my other thought really is that you'd want to think about the keyboard use, because just as we were talking about chair armrests, how they can get in the way, this is going to be a bigger unit or a bigger piece on the armrest pad, so it's going to further limit your ability to get in close to your desk or to your keyboard. So again, I don't know that I would think this is the best option for somebody who is doing a lot of keyboarding. If your tasks were very heavily mouse-based, then I could see this as a good option. And same if you had to do any paperwork, reading, phone use on the desk, you'd want to make sure that you can still get in close. So maybe this makes a better posture for somebody who has right shoulder problems when mousing, but I don't know, does it now create worse postures for the left side of your body, because now that's more reaching? So again, I have only recommended this once in my career several years ago, and it was for somebody who had some shoulder issues. And so again, don't have a lot of information on this one, but I definitely wouldn't go to standardizing this, but I do think there are some options for an accommodation. What mouse options are good for someone with wrist pain? So I kind of combined a bunch of questions that I got about mice or mousing devices for this slide here, because what I find is that a lot of people say, well, what's the mouse that you recommend the most often, or what ergonomic mouse should I order? I get lots of questions like that, and the answer is that I don't recommend the same mouse every time. It's all part of my assessment. So really, if somebody is having issues with the mouse, I think a standard mouse probably works okay most of the time for most people. But if somebody is having wrist pain, then I want to look at maybe a different mousing option. But ultimately, I want to look at the workstation first. I want to look at the working height. I want to make sure their mouse is actually positioned at their elbow height. I want to look for any contact stress points. I want to look at kind of all that root cause, because giving them another mousing device, sure, maybe it uses a little bit of, if it's a different shape or a different style, maybe it uses some different muscles, but we may not have fixed the actual issue. It may not have been that regular mouse that was causing the wrist pain in the first place. Maybe it was the actual height of it. So again, I want it, before I go and recommend or put in, a different mousing device, I do want to look at the rest of the workstation, and I want to look at maybe even putting the mouse on the left side. That could be another option. But then ultimately it comes down to style and fit. So I've got a couple of different mice options here. These are all ones that I recommend on a regular basis, I guess. I don't know that I recommend one more than the other. I probably, if I'm just thinking about the last couple of assessments that I've done, I've probably recommended the Evoluent vertical mouse more often than the other ones that are pictured here, but I think they all have their place. So let me kind of give you a little rundown on some of these mice, and that way then if you've got an issue right now, if you've got somebody asking, or maybe you're curious for yourself, then I think all of these mice could work for somebody with wrist pain, but it is going to depend on a couple different things. So for example, the vertical mouse, it is very similar to a traditional mouse, but it tilts the mouse, so it's now vertical. And so you can see from the picture that it puts your forearm in a different position. It actually puts your wrist in a more neutral position, because it it's like a handshake position, which is anatomical neutral. So this is much more closer to a neutral posture for the wrist. And so for some people, this is going to be a nice, easy fix. It's super easy to learn as well, just because it is so similar to a mouse. It has the same kind of, you use the same fingers to do the clicking. It also promotes a very relaxed grip as well, because the mouse itself is a little bigger, and you can order these in different sizes. I think they come in like a standard and a large. You can also order them for the right and the left hand. So if somebody is a left-handed mouser, you can order this for a left-handed, right? Because the one picture there is just for the right side. If we go down, looking at the contour mouse, this again looks very similar to a traditional mouse, but it is designed to fit to your palm size. So they have a little measuring guide. You measure your palm size kind of on their guide, and then you know if you're going to order a small, medium, large, or extra large. And the mouse itself then promotes a relaxed hand grip as well. You do a lot less gripping because your hand just rests on the mouse. And when you go to click, it's kind of hard to tell from just the picture here, but these mice in particular, the buttons themselves are longer, so that when you go to click on the mouse, you're actually using more of your finger as opposed to just the fingertip. So that could also work for somebody with wrist pain if you're looking to not deviate too much from a standard mouse. And again, the scroll wheel is now for the thumb to do as opposed to the pointer finger. Could be another option. The touchpad at the top right, that's an interesting one. In this case, again, there's no gripping required, so it does help with wrist postures, especially if their pain is related to gripping, right? If the mouse isn't fitting their hand in the first place. What I find with this one, though, is that you got to ask the person whether they like touchpads. If they hate touchpads, if they are never going to use that touchpad on their laptop, if they're cursing it every time, they are probably going to not like this option. Some people love it, though, so I consider this as an option, but often when I'm doing an assessment, I might present one or two options just to kind of see what their like is in terms of, learning curve. And then we have the roller mouse on the bottom here. This one's super interesting because it looks a lot different than a traditional mouse. The learning curve isn't as steep as one might think. I've had a lot of people tell me the feedback in general is that it is easier to use than a touchpad, or it's quicker to learn to use than a touchpad. But there's no gripping. It goes in the middle, right in front of your keyboard, so you can actually use your right and your left hand. It's a pretty cool device. It is on the more expensive side, though. So for that reason, it's not usually the first thing that I recommend. I do usually try to consider other options, but I would say that it's like almost 100% success rate. If somebody's having wrist or shoulder pain and you give them the roller mouse, they are almost always going to be happy because it uses muscles in a very different way. So just some information then on some mice that I recommend. But yeah, it's not like there's just one mouse that's going to be perfect for somebody with wrist pain. Keeping in line with wrist here, are wrist rests recommended? So the ideal or the best practice for typing is that you are floating your hands over the keys when you're typing. Your wrist should not be anchored on that wrist rest when you are typing. I know for some people it might be an easier example is if we say, it's kind of like playing the piano, that your hands should float over the keys, and I know that not everybody plays the piano or maybe took typing lessons, for example, but really when we're talking about best practice, your wrist should not be anchored on the wrist rest or the desk. They should be moving quite freely. So if you have a wrist rest, I know a lot of keyboard trays, for example, just come standard with that pad along the front edge, and I think that they're fine, but we just need to make sure that they are using them during that as a break only. So in between thoughts, as you're reading something, it's kind of a nice cushiony rest. Sometimes I feel that if we're just putting in one of those gel pad wrist rests, for example, that maybe it might be a Band-Aid solution, and maybe we haven't really looked at, okay, well, if the desk is rubbing on their wrists when they're typing, like, well, maybe they're not really at the right height. Is there something else that we need to look at as well? So it's rare that I recommend a wrist rest. However, that being said, when I recommend a keyboard tray, it almost always comes with that pad at the front, and I'm okay with that. So I'm always trying to look at the whole picture, really. I don't think that wrist rests are really ideal for the mouse. So again, I mentioned earlier that the best practice is that the movement should come from the shoulder. So when you put a wrist rest in there on the mouse, I think it actually promotes anchoring. Like it promotes you resting your wrist on that pad when you're mousing, and then it kind of localizes all the movement to the wrist. So I'm really not a fan of it for the mouse. And again, I'm always trying to look at the big picture here to see what's going on. Why are we having pain with the wrist, and is the wrist rest really the answer, or is that just going to help for right now and you know, like the Band-Aid really. So I'm just checking the time here, and so we're about halfway through, which is great, and we've had a couple questions coming in, so that's great too. I wanted to let you know that I know that we've had lots of questions. There's no way, like a lot of questions came into me. I'm answering maybe half of the questions that actually got emailed to me. And so I know that your staff are probably also going to have these questions too. We are recording this webinar, so you'll have that. You'll have the ability to share that. But also, I'm thinking that we've got a good offer for you this month. So how are you going to help your staff address these questions and challenges? You know, if you've got these questions, if they're sending them in, it's likely because staff have been asking you, you want to address them. What's the way, how do we go about doing that? So we're really wanting to help you with that process. So just stay tuned. I know right to the end here, we've got an offer. I think you're going to find it really valuable. It'll be a good way for you to address those challenges and those questions that your staff might have, and a way to pass it on. So I will touch base on that at the end, but I wanted to make note of it now just to keep you all tuned. So here we go. What sit-stand option is the best? Okay, so next to, you know, the dual screen question, so how should I set up 2 screens? I would say that this is probably the next, if not the most equal to the most frequently asked question that I get these days. Is, you know, everything about sit-stand options. Should I be standing at work? You know, and really my answer is be cautious. You know, you really want to assess the needs. I don't think that we all need to be standing at work every day. I think that a lot of people who work at a desk for 7-8 hours a day, they're not going to want to stand for 7 or 8 hours. That's pretty tiring. But if you are looking at making changes to your workstation or to your office stations where you are going to have standing options, you just want to make sure that you're assessing the needs. So for example, when we talked about the keyboard tray early on, we talked about, you know, how to get somebody at elbow height. You can either raise the chair up and they can work with their keyboard and mouse on the desk, or we can lower, you know, if we can't get them up that high, if we can't get them high enough with their chair, or they don't want to be sitting that high because they don't want to have their feet dangling, maybe the footrest isn't really their thing, then we put in a keyboard tray and we lower it. We lower the keyboard and mouse below the desk. So some of these sit-stand options that are on the market, they don't really have that feature. So the 2 that I have pictured here, these are okay options. There's nothing really wrong with them. But what happens is they don't go below the desk. And so if anything, they're going to add maybe a ½ inch to an inch or 2 in height to the desk, because now you're going to have to put your keyboard and mouse on these units. So just keep in mind, if you are going to be putting one of these type of units in for, you know, a shorter worker, for example, maybe it helps them because now they're able to stand, but we may have made a worse situation because now they can't get their keyboard, and when they're sitting, they can't get their keyboard and mouse to their elbow height. Other options would be having a desk where the whole thing goes up and down, or having a unit on the desk where it does have that keyboard tray that can lower down. So either of these, if I'm saying what sit-stand option is the best, I think either of these would be probably my go-to or my preferred, but it is going to depend on, you know, budget. It's going to depend on the space available. Like, are we talking about a private office? Are we talking about a cubicle? Are we talking, you know, about staff who are going to move around? You know, we need to think about all of those things. And so again, all of those factors will come into play in terms of which one I'm going to recommend. So to say which one is the best, I don't have a solid answer for that. It's really going to depend on the situation. I think if we look at the example on the left here, this whole height adjustable table, I always think it's kind of funny when somebody has a keyboard tray on here, because if it's height adjustable, really they should be able to put their keyboard and mouse on the desk, right, and adjust it to their height. What I find with a lot of tables, though, and kind of just as they've become so much more popular, you know, I was looking at getting one for myself, but if I look at my desk right now, is one where it's like a manual adjustment. So before you load all your computer and everything on it, you know, you get out, you do your adjustments with the desk legs with the little notches. And I actually measured my desk and it's like 25 inches high. So I'm not very tall. I'm 5'4", and my desk is actually pretty low. And when I go and look at these height adjustable tables, there are a lot of them. I would say the large majority of them that really don't go below 28 inches. So for me, a height adjustable table, if I were to just order the first one that I came across without really investigating a whole lot, it's probably not going to work for me. But in that case, maybe I would want a keyboard tray. Just now I'm buying a height adjustable desk and a keyboard tray. So, we're adding to the expenses here. But you can get tables that do go lower. So those are just things that lots of factors that you're going to want to consider. I actually did a webinar, and we did one, Jen did one earlier this year, and I did one last year as well on sit-stand topics, and I believe that both of those are recorded. So, I did an entire webinar on sit-stand options, so I'm not going to spend a whole ton of time talking on it. I really could spend a lot of time talking on it just because there's so many questions that come in about this and so many factors to consider. What's the verdict on treadmill desks? I don't know. Have many of you been getting questions on this? I don't get these questions super often, but I would say that 5 years ago nobody had ever asked me about a treadmill desk. And if I think about the last year, I've gotten at least 5 requests. Just in terms of asking, what are my thoughts? Would I recommend them? I have employees asking for these. How do I address that question? I've tried looking up some research. There really is not research out there. So in terms of, what you will read is often from a product company, so saying that it increases your productivity, it can help with concentration, it helps with movement. I don't know that I definitely it helps with movement. We can see that they're walking, but I don't know. I personally wouldn't recommend one for the workplace. Definitely not for your dedicated desk. I do know of at least one workplace where they have some in place, and the way that they do it is really interesting. They've really addressed it from a risk management perspective. So they are shared workstations where you sign up to use them, and before you can use them, they go through a training, you sign a waiver, there are time limits, you can only sign up for them for 15 minutes at a time, for example, and there's a maximum number of sessions you can sign up back to back or per day. All of which I think is really interesting. When you get a treadmill desk, one that is actually designed to be a desk, they do have a maximum speed on it, which is significantly slower than one that you would buy for just exercising on. So also, I think it's like a max speed of 2.5 miles per hour or something really slow like that. But my thoughts really are that that's working out all day. So if you are going to be working at your computer all day, I don't know, are you really going to be want to walk all day? So as a dedicated desk, I'm kind of a hard no on that. And then as an option maybe for a shared workstation, I think it's interesting. I haven't recommended one in my career, but I do know some people. I know an organization that has done it, and it seems to be quite successful. So it's not to say that I would never recommend it, but we would have to, work on what all of those features would look like. I'm just going to pop over to the questions here and see if I have missed anything. Oh, I've got a note here. Just learned that Peel Region is an example of an organization that has some at their site where they can sign out. So that's interesting. I wasn't aware that they did. I think it's Niagara Region is another workplace that has the treadmill desks. So anybody who's considering them, I know those might be 2 places that you might want to look to for some advice or feedback, but it's few and far between where we actually do see some treadmill workstations. What factors play a role in office lighting? So there are lots of things. I think if there actually are lighting guidelines. So you can get a light meter. You can go out and measure lighting in an office and kind of compare it to guidelines. I think the readings are somewhere in the 300 to 500 lux. The lighting levels are measured in lux. And most offices, I've done a couple of lighting assessments over my career, and most offices are within that. If anything, they're too bright or they're above that, right? So now you're looking at ways to, how can we make it less bright so that it's not causing eye strain, right? Ultimately, having an office that is too bright or too dark or shadowy really is going to affect eye strain. That's usually the #1 complaint: eye strain, headaches, tension in the neck from that eye strain. And so there are lots of ways that we can look at glare. So there's reflected glare from your monitor. right? The bright light of your monitor. There is reflection off of the desk, off of the walls. Often, I don't know, it's not something that I've necessarily thought of a whole ton until you start doing these light assessments, but even like the color of the walls or the fact that you have fabric panels in your cubicle, all of those things are factors that help to reduce glare, right? Like choosing the right paint color. If you're in an office where it's, you know, lots of windows and you have white desks that have kind of that lacquer finish and everything is white walls, you know, maybe it looks really pretty, but I don't know if it's necessarily as functional for working. There might be a lot more glare. And then you can also get direct glare from windows. So a lot of people like to have windows in their office, you know, it's kind of a perk. You get a nice view, but if you have your computer, like for example, in this picture here, both of those individuals have their computer screen, they're facing the computer screen and they're facing their window, but on a bright day, it doesn't even necessarily have to be a sunny day, even a gray day where the skies, where like the background light is really white, really light, that can cause a lot of eye strain. So, you know, making sure that you've got blinds in place, like these screens are a nice way that you can actually filter out some of that brightness. Dimming the overhead lights as well. Insufficient light, I would say lately, if I'm thinking about my last year of doing assessments, rarely, I think I've recommended a lamp once, right? So you can look for under cabinet lighting, you can look for lamps, something that really helps to illuminate paperwork. I think mostly that might be more so because I am, you know, less paper. Really, I'm meeting with less people who are doing less and less paperwork. We're going to more of a paperless system. And so, you know, most of your work is done on the monitor and we're not really looking for lamps as much, but less often I'm finding about insufficient light. If you were really concerned, if you did have some comments, or if you thought there were some really shadowy spots in your offices, you could do a lighting assessment. You could get a light meter. They're relatively inexpensive, and you could go around and measure the different spots to see where you might need to adjust your brightness. But I mean, blinds and just positioning of your computer are two of the biggest things that I definitely recommend the most often. Things that we need to look at anyways. Where should the phone be placed? Great question. So it depends really on how much you use the phone. So for somebody who gets, you know, 1 or 2 calls a day, I'm not super concerned about the location of their phone. I hope that when they're on the phone that they are not cradling it, you know, they're not holding the handset between their ear and their shoulder, and you know, those are things that I might be concerned about. But if it's a really far reach, you know, it's once or twice a day, I'm not super concerned about that. Really, placement is going to become a bigger factor when you are using the phone quite often. So several times an hour, if you're making dialing calls, I'm thinking like a reception area, for example, where they're taking a lot of incoming calls, the phone placement is going to be a big deal for them. And so ideally you want it within an easy reach, right? So you shouldn't have to lean forward or necessarily even lean away from your backrest if you're having to answer the phone often. So you really want to think about the frequency of use, and then whether it's going to go on the right side or the left side. I usually suggest that it goes on the side of your non-dominant hand. So if you are right-handed and you put the phone on your right side, it is very likely and you'll have to kind of watch yourself, see if you do this yourself, but if you are right-handed, you have your phone on your right side, when you pick it up, it is more likely that you are going to cradle the phone, that you're going to put it between your shoulder and your ear, because inevitably you're going to look something up on the computer, or you're going to need your right hand free to write a note, and so you'll do that. You'll tuck the handset in your shoulder there, which is terrible neck and shoulder postures. And so what I suggest then is, if you're right-handed, try putting your phone on your left side. In theory, what will happen is that you will answer the phone with your left hand because it's closer, and then when you need to take a note or use your mouse to look something up on the computer, your hand is already going to be free because your left hand is holding the phone. So something to think about if that would work for you. I don't know, you might have to play around. It still takes some coaching. People who are right-handed tend to be very right-handed, and so it's not to say that they're never going to cradle the phone, but I do find that putting the phone on the non-dominant side kind of gives the non-dominant hand more to do, kind of helps to give a break to the dominant hand, and in theory it should help to reduce those awkward neck postures. So I have gone through all of the questions that I had planned for today. If you guys have any questions that I haven't addressed, or if I did answer some of your questions and you wanted more clarification, by all means, feel free to type them in there, and we will do a question session in a few seconds here. But what I wanted to tell you about was our webinar offer for this month. So again, I know that there are lots of questions when it comes to office ergonomics. Sometimes it seems that it can be kind of simple. Well, you just sit at your computer and you adjust it like this and you get yourself looking like all those diagrams of neutral posture. But realistically, it's not always as simple as that, and we know that lots of people have questions. We're always getting questions related to office ergonomics. And so if you are that point person in your organization and you're getting all of those questions, what is it that you're doing? How are you helping your staff? How are you addressing those questions, those challenges? So to help out with that process, we believe that education really is the key thing. It's not to say that when you go out that everybody needs a full one-on-one detailed assessment. Some people do if they're having challenges, for sure they do. But I do feel that office ergonomics is something that we can teach people to do a lot of helping of themselves. So if we give them the tools, we tell them, here's how you can set up your monitor and why, then they can go back and make those changes. And we find that that's actually a method of training that we find quite successful in how we deliver office ergonomics training. So we might start out in the morning with a 1-hour session with a large group of people. It's also a good way to target a larger group of people. And we give them all of that education on how to go through setting up their chair, their keyboard, their mouse, what height, and understanding the why, giving them those tips. And then what we do is we have them go back to their workstation. They have to try to make all the adjustments themselves, and then we come around throughout the day and meet with them one-on-one. So they get a short bit of time with us, and what we find is it actually kind of forces them to go back and apply what they learned in that session, because they know that the ergonomist is coming around and going to check on them, right? And so really that one-on-one time is meant to kind of address any outstanding challenges that they weren't able to fix themselves, or that, can you just check and make sure that my posture looks okay? Like, I adjusted my keyboard, but does this look like the right height? So that's what that time is spent doing. So that's our offer for this month, is that when you're doing some workstation reviews, we will do that office ergonomics, that training session, that initial one for your group of staff. We'll do that one at no charge for free. So that's at least a value of about $495. And so if you're looking for a way to target your staff about office ergonomics in a bit of a different way, I know there's lots of office ergonomics, you read some slides online, or you read a little manual or a couple of tip sheets. And so this is like a different approach, right? It's more, we could call it more of a workshop approach. So it's more interactive. It can be a little bit more interesting and engaging. And again, we find that we do get some good success, again, because it's forcing people to take what they've learned and make adjustments to their own workstation right then and there. So if this is something that's interested, if you think this is of value to your staff, I always send out a follow-up email after all of the webinars just letting you know when the recording link is available. So I'll also put a reminder about this webinar offer in that email as well. And if you are interested and you want to talk more about how to get this offer working for you at your organization, just reply to my email or give me a call and we can talk about that. So let's move on to any other questions that have come in. I'll put up my contact information here for now, just so you've got that. That's the main phone line and the main email address. And you can also check out our website too if we've got any other. We always have some news articles up, right, that might answer some of your questions as well, some past news. So I am just going to read the question here. So I have an employee that has wrist pain, both sides, which is severe. She's using a wave keyboard, which I think promotes non-neutral posture. What do you think of these alternate keyboards? Oh, fabulous question. Okay, so if you guys can picture the wave keyboard, it is quite a large keyboard. So it looks very similar to like a traditional keyboard, but it's bigger and it basically has a curve feature to it. So I'm thinking I'm probably referring to the same one that you're asking about. So I like this keyboard for some people only. So again, I mentioned myself, I'm 5'4", and I'm a pretty petite frame. So for myself, for example, or for other people with a petite frame, I don't think the keyboard is a good option. I think it does actually promote worse posture than it does better posture, because in order to get your hands on the keys at the angle with the size of that keyboard, I think it actually splays your elbows out makes your shoulder posture a bit worse. So I'm not sure that it necessarily promotes this quote-unquote ergonomic wrist posture. I know they're called an ergonomic wave keyboard, but in that case, I think that the word ergonomic is kind of used as a marketing gimmick. There are other keyboards that I think could work. It's rare that I recommend a keyboard that kind of has that wave to it. I think there is a smaller keyboard. Actually, Microsoft now makes one called the Microsoft Sculpt, which is, again, that kind of splayed shape, but it doesn't have a number pad, so the overall keyboard is a lot smaller. And so that I find works better for petite people, and even I just think it's a good keyboard for, in general, sizes, all sizes. And I also think that there's another keyboard called the Freestyle, the Kinesis Freestyle keyboard, and it actually is a keyboard where it's like split in two pieces, so you get to choose the angle that you put your keys at and how far apart you want them. So I think that's also a good option. It's a little bit of a higher price point than the Sculpt keyboard, for example, and especially I think that large keyboard, that Microsoft Wave keyboard, that's probably the lowest price point, and it's one that I find people get because it's called the ergonomic keyboard. But again, we want to kind of look at the employee size and make sure that we've addressed the other issues as well that might be causing that wrist pain. So hope that helps answer that question. Oh, I've got a comment in just saying that somebody's saying that they use that Microsoft Sculpt keyboard and they are a small stature and they find it a good fit. So that's great. I've used that keyboard a little bit too. I've just tried it, like literally typed on it for 20 minutes type of thing, and I thought that it was I did like it, but I don't have one myself. So looking at some other questions here, what about a kneeling chair or an exercise ball? So in my entire career, I have recommended a kneeling chair 0 times, but I know that my colleague, my partner Jennifer, she has recommended a kneeling chair once, but it was an interesting one. It was not necessarily because we thought that it was the best option. It was just that with that specific case, the employee was having some very kind of complicated challenges, and she had actually trialed a kneeling chair as well as some other chairs, and so the kneeling chair was one chair that we suggested in kind of a rotation of seating options that she used. I think that there is probably not a ton of research out there. I know I actually had a roommate back in university who had a kneeling chair, so I have tried it out. It wasn't uncomfortable, but I think it's an odd chair, just it's a lot of pressure on the knees. I don't know, I would never recommend it for somebody as their main desk chair unless they were having some very specific discomfort or challenges. That would be similar, an exercise ball. Do you know what, I actually have some links on, there are some research documents out there on exercise balls. Again, I don't think that it's a good chair for a permanent desk chair. If you wanted to use one at home or whichever, I also have some safety concerns with those ball chairs as well. So I don't think that it's a great desk chair. Oh, here's a question. I love this question. What do you think about number pads on keyboards? I find that they can be problems with right-handed people. So yes, number pads on keyboards. I do think that they're quite challenging. If I'm thinking about, you know, one of the top things that I recommend is that I often recommend something related to the keyboard and the mouse, and it's because of the number pad. So, you know, not everybody uses the number pad a whole lot, and so if we're looking at the traditional keyboard, and if you've got like a traditional keyboard with the number pad on the left side, and then you've got your mouse, you have a lot of stuff on the right side, and what'll actually happen is that when you center your keys so that you're typing right in front of you, what you'll find is that your mouse gets kind of spread out or gets pushed out to the right side. So I actually find that it causes more reaching or some awkward shoulder postures for a lot of people. And so ways that I get around that is that, you know, there are keyboards out there where you can get it where the number pad is totally gone. Just be careful of those laptop keyboards or the keyboards, you know, that you can plug into smartphones, because the keys get a lot smaller. So ideally you're looking for a keyboard where you still have full-size keys so that we're not like compromising wrist postures with typing. And then you can get keyboards where the number pad is detachable. So for example, that Microsoft Sculpt keyboard that I mentioned before, if you do a quick Google search on that, I'm pretty sure it comes with a separate number pad. That way then you could put it on the number pad on the left side and then have your mouse on the right side, kind of bring your mouse closer to your body. And if you really were struggling with using the number pad with your left hand, but you don't use it nearly as often as your mouse, then you could still put it on the right side, but just you're basically flipping the spot of your mouse and your number pad. So I don't know, I'm not, it'd be nice to see some standard keyboards coming with some more flexibility. I think that the design is not necessarily great with how much we use the mouse these days. I don't know that the standard keyboard is always a great fit. Another question. Let me just check the time here and see how we're doing. Okay, we are just about 11:30, so I'm going to answer this one more question and then we'll sign off. What I'm finding is that there are a lot of questions that I didn't answer. I can see that there are more questions being asked that I am not going to be able to get to. And so what I'm going to suggest is a follow-up webinar. So I will send out a link. We can do another Office Ergonomics Frequently Asked Questions one. I'll set it up for next week, next Thursday, same time, 10:30 to 11:30, and I'll send that link out as well. That registration link will be available on the website. So, there's just so many questions that have come in. Oops. So many questions have come in. So we'll do that for next Thursday, November 3rd, 10:30 to 11:30. And that way then I can help address any of the questions that I haven't gotten to, because I can see, like, I'm scrolling down, I got quite a few questions. So last question here is, I have used mouse bridges in the past, but it's hard to get a proper fit. Any recommendations? I think when I first started my career as an ergonomist, I recommended the mouse bridge a couple of times, but overall what I find is that I don't really like them. I think is really what I've learned is that it actually puts your mouse a little bit higher, right? So a mouse bridge is something that kind of sits over your number pad, so your mouse can actually sit on the number pad. I'm not crazy about that, because ideally what I like to see is the mouse and the keyboard on the same plane, like right at the same height. I even find there are some keyboard trays where they have like a circle or a square mouse pad that kind of swivels out from under the keyboard, and it makes the mouse that much lower. It makes people stretch or like outstretch their arm a little bit to use the mouse a bit more. So in an ideal setting, I like one straight board that you can put your mouse and keyboard on the same plane, and I don't recommend those mouse bridges for that reason. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in today. Lots of questions. I appreciate all the questions. I appreciate the engagement. That's great. I love that you all come to the webinars and you have lots of questions for me. It's kind of nice. It makes me feel that that maybe we're in the same room, right? I can't see you, but it's nice to have all of the questions come in so that I'm not just talking to a blank monitor here. So thank you so much for tuning in. Again, I will have that followed up frequently asked questions just to answer all of these other questions that have come in. I think that might be a good option. So watch for that link and that registration link on our website, and we'll see you shortly. Thanks very much, everybody. Stay tuned for the webinar recording as well. Have a great day.